Awesome. So today we are doing React. We are going to get an introduction on React, and then we're going to create our first project and just kind of see what it looks like and play around with it a little. Let me just present this. You guys can still see my screen, right? Okay, awesome. So many of you have heard of us talking about React, and React is a front-end framework that was developed by Facebook in 2012, and it was open sourced in 2013. And it's based on the idea of building reusable components. So your entire page is just going to be composed of little building blocks, pretty much, that you can reuse and kind of manage on a page, and it makes it easier to build front-end applications. So this idea of building reusable components leads us to mix both the markup and the functional logic. So before we were having like an HTML page that contains pretty much most of our markup or all of our markup. And then we had a separate JavaScript file that would carry our front-end logic. But now React has a hybrid syntax, which is JSX, which combines the two. So you're able to have markup within the logic, and it makes everything so much easier. And we'll see an example of that a little later. But yeah, so React is, I believe, currently the most popular front-end framework in America, in North America at least. And there are several other options that people use. So Vue is a big one. There's also Angular, and I haven't heard of Svelte, or at least I haven't used it, but I guess some companies use it. Also, there is React Native, which is primarily for mobile development. So instead of having to learn like Java for Android, or I think Kotlin now, or I think, is it Swift for iOS? I'm not sure exactly.
Yeah, Swift.
Yeah. So yeah, so instead of having to learn both of those languages to create the mobile app, you can do the front end using one base language, which is kind of cool. So we've seen that our Django application would kind of give us in this form. So the model view controller, we've seen this scheme before, where our models are our data objects, our view is our templates, and then our controller is our views.py. So now we're going to replace the templates with React. So we're going to have an entire React application to take over that. And we'll talk to the backend of Django. So we'll still have models, we'll still have views. But yeah, React will handle the simpler front-end logic. So React it's like by itself, it's not that big of a library, but it's in the center of a more complex ecosystem. So there's a bunch of different libraries that interconnect and work together. So we use a bundling tool, or like a tool that creates our application for us. So we don't really have to care about importing all of these individually. They kind of just all get included together. So React is our main library. The React DOM is a package that allows you to what is it called? Have a DOM specific method that you can pretty much use as your gateway to your application. So you pretty much just use this once, and it's at your top level React file. So it gives you a render method, which allows you to render whatever you want on the DOM. And in our case, it's going to be our entire React application. Another part of this is React scripts, optional but highly recommended. So part of when we do create React app, we have a lot of Webpack and Babel library stuff, which I'll explain in the next slide. But yeah, I'll explain it in a sec. So Webpack is, what is it called? It's a tool that allows us to bundle all of our assets, so our images, our JavaScript files, our fonts, all of it into a neat package that gets sent to the browser. That way it's easier to read, it's easier. Yeah, so instead of, what is it called? Instead of sending a lot of tiny files of every single dependency that we have, which we'll see that it ends up being a lot. There's a lot of different dependencies and libraries. It bundles it all into one big file or a few big files, and that gets sent to the browser versus having many, many small ones. Babel is, so pretty much there are advanced features of JavaScript that we might want to use in our application that are not yet supported by all of the browsers that are out there. And there are also some features that we want to use in our applications that are not natively supported by any browser, like JSX. So Babel pretty much allows us to write JavaScript in whatever style we want, and it automatically converts it in a way that is readable to all of the browsers that are out there, which is pretty cool. These are some code snippets from the 2 files, which we don't really have to worry about any of that, because all of this gets taken care of for us. Okay, any questions so far? I'm kind of just going past these real quick. No? All right. So how do we create an app? So if you remember our command to create a Django application, so a Django project, which is either Django admin start project with the project name, or like Python-m-Django, you know, that one that we used a lot. So the actual React gives you this command line. So npm create React app, and then you put your app name, whatever you want it to be, and it scaffolds an entire project and installs all of your dependencies and everything's ready to go. But so we can use this, but we are going to use a tool called Vite, which is the French word for fast, and it's literally just faster. It builds our application faster, and according to them, they offer us a better development or dev server. So when we're developing, things reload faster and all that. So the main difference is how you start the project. Everything else is pretty much the same. The file structure is a little bit different that they give us, but that's pretty much it. Raphael, do you have anything to add about Vite, since you like it?
I do like it. That's really all I want to add. I think you covered it. It's
Awesome.
just like faster than Create React App.
Awesome. Yeah, Jake.
Where do we put the app name?
Sorry?
Where do we name our app? Just at the end of like npm create Vite at latest?
Oh, so here, when you do create Vite, it gives you like options afterwards. So it prompts you to add more stuff.
Oh,
so
okay.
Yeah, so after you do this this command, it prompts you for a project name, a framework type. So you're actually able to do more than just React in Vite. You can do a React project, Angular, Vue. There's like a bunch of different templates that they have.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Gotcha.
yeah.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Of course. And we'll see an example of that when we start the code.
Is that pretty common? Like, because React is obviously very popular. Is it also very popular for people to use that tool within it to create their React apps?
Vite or Create React App?
Vite.
It is pretty common to find people using something other than Create React App. I've seen Create React App. I've seen specific ones to companies. So some companies have their own React project scaffold. So what this does is pretty much just install your dependencies, create like a base project that kind of like how our Django like start project thing just created a bunch of files for us. This is what it will do. I haven't seen Vite in the wild yet, but I kind of want to use it now whenever I use or make React applications, because it is better. I like it more. But yeah, does that answer your question? So it can be used. Either could be used. It's not too much of a difference, pretty much, when you're actually developing. Yeah, good. I should probably have the chat open. Okay. So we hear this word components. Does anyone want to kind of take a stab at what a component is, or maybe you already know? Yes. No? Do I call on people?
You can.
I can. First person I see on the pictures is Justin. Yes, I see you covering your face.
No, what? God, okay, what am I doing?
What's a component? What do you think a component is?
It's like a module. It's a piece of something. It's if I make a component, I can use it wherever I want in several places.
Yeah, that's pretty much it. So in React, components comprise of like HTML style blocks that have their own logic built into them. So we'll see examples of that. I like using components. So there's a few buzzwords. I don't know if they're whatever it is. So components pretty much let you split the UI into small reusable pieces. So if we look at this page here, this is a component. This little button is a component. This card is a component. This other card is a component. We could also probably say this row is a component in itself. This top row is also a component. So now when you're creating your applications, you want to kind of think of how can I design this in a way that it's like pieces fitting into little pieces. So like I was saying, like Lego pieces before, or building blocks, you have this component making up, what is it called? So let's say there's a row here, right, where the hiking, agriculture, camping ones are. So this is just one component, and then you can multiply it. So you can just keep calling that component that you created. It's like creating, so you know how in HTML we have like a button tag or like a row or whatever it is. So here you're able to create those by yourself, and then you can call them in your code, and it instantiates a thing that looks like the thing that you want, and you can send in information that is specific to whatever you want to render there. So any questions about that? Is that kind of like self-explanatory?
I was kind of doing this with the include function of templating.
Yeah.
Yeah,
That-
kind of
yeah,
the same
that-
thing, just building a little template and then, including it and giving it information.
Yeah, that's perfect. Now you're already thinking in React, in React terms.
It sounds a
Um,
lot like the, like for element in array, make this paragraph of code. And that
Exactly.
paragraph of code would be like a component, and you're just multiplying it by however many elements in the array.
That's exactly how a lot of these are going to be. You have like an array of data, and you just loop through this, and you create a new component per piece of data, pretty much. Yeah. Okay, so attached to these components, there are two things that hold our data. There's a thing called prop and a thing called state. So props or properties, this is data that can be sent into your component. So think of variable or parameters that you send into a function. That's pretty much what a prop is. And it's usually sent in from the parent component into the child component. And the child component just uses that data. It doesn't manipulate it in any way. And so it just uses it. State, however, is an object that stores data inside the component itself. So if you have like a counter button or something like that, or a counter object, let's say, it will have information about the count inside of it. So it will house it locally pretty much. And yeah, so it's similar to props, but it's only local to that specific component. And each time you instantiate a component, it will have state inside of it. And yeah, so JSX, like I mentioned, it looks and acts like HTML, but it's actually syntax extension to JavaScript. And it allows us to do JavaScript in line with HTML. So like we did in Django, how we had the curly braces, and we do like Python-ish code inside of the templates. So that's pretty much how it's going to be. But this time it's actual JavaScript. It's not like a specific version of it. So yeah, if we look at this like component 3 over here, even component 3 can be broken down into different pieces. So we can have this top piece and we can have this bottom piece. So our card image and then our card main.
So are those the states or no?
No, so these are actual components.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so the state might be the rating. So inside the component star rating, it might have the actual rating as its state. And I believe this is like the count of how many people rated or something like that. So those would be part of, it could be state or prop. It depends on where the data is coming from, and if you're sending it from the top component, or if you're calculating it inside on the bottom, like inside the actual component itself. So here, component 3, what would it look like? It would have a card image and it would have a card main. So these are the two main components inside of that one. And then card image would also have, so it would have probably the image itself, and then another component called favorite icon, which is inside of it. And then the card main component has another component called the star rating over here. So this is a snippet of what the code would look like. And so yeah, component 3 would have, oops, sorry about that. Card main or card image, card main, and then card image would have the favorite icon and then something else, which would probably be the image itself. And then card main, which is this part, elements that would be like the title, description, price, and hours. And then it also has another component nested within it, which is the star rating. So whenever you look at a website, just kind of see where you can draw the boxes, and that can kind of tell you what components should be where. And if it falls within it, that component is most likely a child component. Any questions about this? Yeah, Jake.
What is in like the little tree in the top right, what is props saying?
So props is the data that would be sent in from this top component. So let's
It's
say
not
we
saying
have-
that the card image and card main are properties though, right?
Yeah. So when we instantiate card main, we'll see this example in the code. It will be a little more clearer, but let's say here we want to send in the title for this card. So we would say card main, and then we would say title equals whatever title we want to send in up here when we call it. So it's kind of like a function. And then when you're inside the card main, you're able to access your property. And then you can use it inside the title here. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
Dan, I saw your hand up.
You just answered the question. Thanks.
Okay, awesome. Any other questions? Okay, moving on. Okay, so there's two ways of creating components. There's a class-based way. So, oops. So this is the syntax pretty much. So it's just a class and extends a component, and then there are things that are specific to the class that you do. But what we're going to work with is the functional based components, which is a newer way of doing it. So React every now and then decides to change their entire way of doing things. So this is the best way now to write components. I don't know how it's going to change in the next few years, but currently this is the most updated version, and it's to use functional based components. It's I know you can't see it here, but it's slightly sleeker. In some portions you write less code, like here you have just a return, here you have to put a render, and then, sorry, I keep moving, please. Here you have to put a render and then a return inside of it. So it just handles a few things. And also with functional based components, there are these things called hooks, which I will explain a little today, and then even more in depth, I think tomorrow. We're covering hooks, or maybe the day after. But yeah, just wanted to note that there are two different ways of doing it, but we're doing the functional way. Okay. Any questions actually? Okay. So each component has its own life cycle. From the time you start your server, let's say, or you go to that page, it first mounts. So mounting is the first time it renders to the DOM. If there is any underlying data that changes, so anything in the state, or I believe also props, it updates.
Yeah, either of those count.
Yeah. So whenever it changes your component re-renders, it may or may not re-render, but it depends on how you're changing the prop and state, which we'll talk about later. And then unmounting, which is when a component is removed from the DOM. So there are these three main events that we'll kind of think of when we're developing. So in the class-based component, we have these lifecycle methods. So component did mount, should component mount, or should component update, component did update, and then component will mount. So these allow you a way to override, not override, but you can access the component at different times. So if right after the component mounts, and if it mounts, then you can go into this, it would go into this function, and you can write whatever you want it to do during that time. So it overrides the default behavior. So the default behavior is probably like do nothing, and you would add stuff to do during those times. Just to give a better kind of show of when each are happening. So when a component mounts, it calls the constructor of that component, which during, like with the functional version, we don't really have to care about the constructor, if I'm not mistaken. So it calls the constructor and then it renders. So after it renders on the page, component did mount happens. And then when an update thing, should component update happens before it actually is going to update, before it renders. So you can do something there. And then component did update happens after the rendering. And then component will unmount is right before it unmounts. And that's because once it unmounts, you don't have access to it. So in this, you can like, I don't know, you can clear data or do something that you want to do right before your component finishes. So I mentioned hooks. So hooks are going to allow us to interact with the data at different points in the components lifecycle without using these class-based components. So now we can access the data, the state or the props using functional components. So instead of all of these, we can just use effect, and we'll see more examples of that later. Any questions? Awesome. And this is just a reminder, props is pretty much just information that is passed from the caller or the parent component. And it's like parameters in a function call or class initialization. So when you're first instantiating an object or something like that, this is what this is. And then state is information that is private to a component and is able to change. And that is it for our slides. Any questions?
So is props like more used for like when you're kind of creating the component, and then state is just to change the values in the component?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so props, yeah, they get sent in when you're creating the component, and they're sent in from the parent. So props could be data or they could be a function also. So if a function is managed in your parent component, you can send it in as a parameter pretty much, and it will use that. And you would do that if there's specific state that's in a parent component. I feel like I'm confusing now, but it'll become a little more clear when we see the examples.
So I want to add a little bit here. Definitely a really great metaphor about props being like parameters in a function call. I think another way that I like thinking about this is that props are like properties of an HTML element, which I think that's actually why they're called props. So, like on a paragraph or a div or whatever, you can have class equals whatever, style equals anything, href or source, other more interesting properties, just different pieces of information about an HTML element that aren't like hard coded into the definition of it, but are like chosen at the time it's used. Those are properties. So I feel like thinking about HTML elements is a nice kind of metaphor, because these are essentially like custom HTML elements that we're defining. Although they get more complicated because, like Zain was saying, we can pass functions in as properties. So things get interesting then. Sorry, that was my soapbox. You can continue.
Thank you. Kaylee, yeah.
I was just curious, did you say we were gonna be using the class-based components?
No,
Eventually-
we're gonna use the function base. one.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, who's ready to see some code? Okay, so here I'm just in my notes folder. I'm gonna open a terminal. All right. So to start, I believe all of you should have Node installed on your machine. So you can do npm or npx. So npx is, I believe you don't have to worry about different versions of npm or Node, like it manages stuff on its own. I'm not fully sure. Yeah.
So let me just mention this real quick. The differences are kind of subtle. npm is for installing something into your machine. npx is for installing or using it. So normally, like, there's one command to install a package and then a different command to use it after you've installed it. npx lets you install it and then use it in one command. Or if you've already installed it, it'll check that you've already installed it and then use that version instead of installing a new version of it. So it can be kind of useful for like when we want to use a package that's like specific to one project, but we don't want to install it globally. We wouldn't actually add it to the path, so we wouldn't be able to just like type it out the command line and have it be recognized. But if we use npx, then it can like use the version that is installed in this local project without actually adding it to the path. It's not too critical that you get all that, but it is a little bit different from the regular npm command.
Thank you. That I googled it yesterday and I didn't really get a straight answer. So thanks. Okay, so I'm gonna start by doing the create vite command. So npm create vite. It's asking me for a project name. I'll just say intro React project. You can give it any name you'd like. So here we choose our framework. I'm going to choose React. And then React, this is React TypeScript. I just want regular React. And there we go. It's created a project for me. So if we look into what it's done so far, it created these two folders. So public folder that seems like it has an icon. Source, which is where all of our source code will go, and I'll kind of go through that in a bit. A git ignore, which is always helpful when it's pre-populated. An index.html, which is our main entryway. This is our document. This is our main website, pretty much. Package.json, this holds information specific to the application on, so it has the name of the application. It also has what dependencies we'll want. So all of this is pre-populated when we create the application. And so we'll see we have to run npm install, which is going to install all of our dependencies for us. Yeah, Terrence.
Yeah, quick question. Is this not done in a virtual environment?
No, should we be doing it in a virtual environment, Raphael?
No, we're not installing any Python dependencies for this project. For this week, actually, we're not going to be installing any Python dependencies. So we do not need a virtual environment. Virtual environments are only used in Python to segregate our different dependencies from one project between the others. And that's because Python doesn't like natively have this concept of per project dependencies. Normally everything in Python is installed globally, so we kind of have to hack it with virtual environments. JavaScript, fortunately, has this notion built in of per project dependencies. So when we npm install everything, it already knows that it's just for this project and it's not global on a machine. So everything you see in the package JSON, like this is, so this package JSON is like our requirements.txt basically. And when we actually do npm install to like grab all these dependencies, it's going to create a folder called, it's going to create a folder for us called node modules, which is essentially the virtual environment. That's going to contain all of the dependencies specific to this project, separate from our other similar node projects.
Right.
So any other questions? Another file that is included is this vite config, and this just tells us that we're using React. I'm assuming, so if you see in the package.json, the React plugin is one of the dev dependencies, so it just allows it to install the correct libraries that we will need. Okay, so it's really nice. It tells us what to do next. So I'm going to cd into my new project, and then I'm going to run npm install, which is going to install my dependencies. So if you look here to the left, node modules popped up. So this is just going to be a bunch of libraries that our app is going to use on the back end. We never change this. We never touch the node modules folder. It gets updated. If we want to install something else, we add it into the package.json, or if we just do, like, if we're in our project and we do npm install package name, it adds it automatically. So we don't really need to touch any of that. Okay, so we did our npm install, and now we can do npm run dev. And so run dev, this is part of the scripts that's here. So you can run dev for this command. This just runs our server. We can build it and we can preview it. So these are our script names pretty much. And yeah, it gives us port 5173, which is a little odd. But here. And this is what our application looks like. I don't know why it's dark, but.
Are you running something else on port 8000?
No.
Weird.
Yeah, very weird. This is, yeah, I'm pretty sure this is their default, because I tried it multiple times and that was the port that it gave me.
Probably a French thing.
Probably. But yeah, so this is our first application. It gives us a few cool like components, so some glow, a rotation. It also gives us a little counter. So if we wanted to see an example of that, it's already included. Okay, so let's change some of this code. Sec. Sorry, this is the wrong. Struggling with my apps. 1 sec. Okay. There we go. All right, so now we see our project. Let's look at our source code. So what's rendering what we just saw? Our main entry, like we said, is our index. So in here, we have our regular HTML document, the header, and then in the body, we have the script. So our main JavaScript script is main.jsx. So let's look in there. Pretty much this file, you don't need to add anything unless it's something specific to like browser stuff. So here's the create DOM, or sorry, the React DOM library that we talked about. So this gives us a root element. So we were able to do document.getElement by ID and root, which is, oops, sorry, this one. So this is our root. And it allows us to inject, sorry, I'm going through files a lot. Okay. It allows us to inject our components in there. So inside that root element, we're able to render this.
So sorry, when you say this is our root, could you go back? Do you mean that whole index.h? Oh, this div right there inside the body. Is that
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Got it.
So
Okay.
it just injects the JavaScript components into this.
So once you start adding additional HTML pages, will you add that div root to each of those?
So we don't need to add any HTML. This is our one and only HTML page, and this is going to be it. We don't change it. We can change the title and stuff. We don't really need to add stuff to it. Everything else will be handled on the JavaScript side. And this is our main, this is our first JavaScript file that is connected to our index.
Okay, I'm sure that will make sense as we keep going. So, okay.
Yeah. So this is, so think of it as you have one HTML page, and this one HTML page is rendering this what is it called? This piece of JavaScript, or this piece of these components, this piece of React components. And inside this app component is going to be our app. So it's pretty much encapsulating things into containers, if you think about it like that. So this container is going to render in our HTML, and everything that we write will go into JSX files, and that will fall into our app. So for our sake right now, or like for our case right now, you don't have to really do anything at all with your main.jsx. We're only changing our app, if that makes sense. Does it make a little more sense?
I'm sure it would. I was initially thinking, well, we're still using Django, so like we have to have different URL paths, but I'm thinking it's probably just going to be you create all the components and then your JavaScript is going to direct where they all go, but I'm sure it'll make sense as you keep going.
Yeah, we'll see we're not going to see redirection today, but we'll see it very soon. Yeah. So it will make sense. Okay, so this is our main file. I'm gonna do a split screen here. That way. Okay, just so you can see things that are changing. What was it? This is gonna take some getting used to. Okay. So this is our main component. I am going to kind of delete everything and just do a very simple example. So I need these, and okay. So the nice thing is we can also just have our CSS files imported into our JavaScript. So we don't have to import them using like script tags or anything into HTML. So here we have an app.css that's written. And it's just component specific to our app. If you also notice the index.css, so the difference is the index.css is going to be called into for the main, what is it called? The main file. And that usually will hold stuff that is general to the app itself. So if you think font families, like general light color schemes, stuff like that. So something that you want to be uniform throughout your entire app. And then this like the app.css, and maybe later on we'll add specific CSS files for specific components. This will be component specific. So here in our app, we have just a few things that, you know, do the spin, do the hover, actions, all of that stuff. So yeah, that's generally how it's built right now. Okay. So in our app.js, or JSX. Oops. Okay. So what do we want to do? First, we create the component. So it's going to be a function. This is the syntax. So function app, and then it will have a return. And this is pretty much the basis of it. And we also want to do export default app. And this will allow us to import this into different files. So here we were importing app from .app, right? This allows us to actually export this component. Okay. So our HTML elements are going to go in our return statement. And every time you create an element or inside your return, it has to be encapsulated by a singular module. So in here, I'll just put everything inside a div. So it doesn't like you returning, let's say, 2 divs. Oops. Yeah, so it'll give an error with this. It just wants one clean package, pretty much. Okay, so just do a simple hello world. I'm just gonna do hello there because I feel like hello world is very overplayed. It's too much. And there we go. So it updated automatically. Add that. Awesome. So Alicia, yeah, you can incorporate Bootstrap with React. We'll see that later. But Bootstrap has their components, so you can do like the imports in here. So import whatever component name it is from Bootstrap. So that's going to be its own library, and you can import it and use those components too. Very helpful. Yeah, Justin.
Can you pop back over to where the index.html is, where this is going? So you just have a div ID root. And then you have that root ID giving just a simple H1 hello there. But
No,
it's
so this root is being populated by the main.jsx,
yeah,
which
okay.
we're using this React DOM function,
Right.
or sorry, the create root function that takes the element which we created, so the root element here by ID, and then it renders in that element this piece of code.
I'm wondering, I guess, is the root ID already has CSS on it because it's like centered in the middle of your page, but you didn't indicate that. Normally, some
so-
raw HTML would have just popped up in the top left corner, but it didn't. So I'm curious.
So yeah, index.css has
Oh,
specific
okay.
stylings. So
Does it come with that, or is that just part of?
this came with the scaffolding, like the Vite. It had a bunch of
Interesting.
stylings already added, and I didn't delete any of them.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Kind of a normal behavior to center stuff, I guess.
Yeah, I could just unimport.
I was just curious where that was coming from.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Of course. Yeah, see, if I deleted that.
A little different, still centered, but yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
so apparently the app.css is what is centering it. So if I do this, oops, don't want to do it. There we go.
Yeah, I see. Okay.
Yeah.
So it comes with some CSS framework stuff.
Yeah.
Thanks.
What am I doing? Why is it? Okay. How do I go back? There we go. Okay. Okay. Any other questions? I think I saw another hand up, but I didn't catch who. No. Okay. So yeah, pretty much when you make your updates, you should be able to just save and it automatically renders on your page and you can see it in real time. All right. Let's create a little bit more functionality and see what it looks like. If you guys remember from last week, when we're creating something that like a button that we want to click and we want to do something with data, we would have our HTML file and then we would connect it in a way to JavaScript, and then we do stuff like get elements and update elements and all that stuff. So now we'll see how we can do that in React in a much easier way. So I'm going to import this hook called useState. So this is going to be one of our most important hooks that we're going to use. Okay. So we're going to import useState from React. And then inside of our app, we are going to create some pieces of state. So let's see. Okay. So useState is going to, so we're going to use it like this. Okay, so there's two parts to useState, an input, and then it's going to output two things. It's going to output a variable. So we're going to instantiate a variable and it will give us access to that variable itself and then a method that will allow us to change that variable. So let's say I want to call this counter because I want to make a little counter button thing. So I'm going to call it counter, and then the second one is going to be a function which we'll call set counter. And this is the general convention. So whatever the name of the variable is, and then the function is set, whatever that variable is. And the 0 that I'm sending in, this is just going to say that initialize counter with 0. So if I send in 2, our initial value is going to be 2. So let's make it 0. Okay. So let's do gonna give this a class name app. And what am I gonna do here? I'm just gonna do a small header. And say my button click counter app. And then I'm going to add a button. Also, the way you create buttons here is a little easier. I guess it's actually kind of the same, but easier how to handle clicks and stuff. So I'm going to call this button my button. And then on click, I'm going to create a function called increment counter, which I don't have yet. And then actually I'll make this full screen so you guys can see. And then here I'll just click me. Okay, so that looks good. And then I'll have just an element to output my data. So ID equals seems like I can't spell today at all. Okay. And then we'll say you clicked the button something times. So so like we saw in Django, we're able to kind of insert variables and like through curly braces. So it's kind of similar here. You only have to use one. So in here we have access to counter. So I'm just going to use that. Okay. So that looks good. Gonna save. That's not the right one. All right, I'm just gonna close this out real quick. Okay. And then here, there's nothing here because I might have not saved. Okay. So I just need to create our handler, so our increment counter function. So constant increment counter equals parentheses. Okay, and here we're gonna do set counter. So we're gonna call the function that allows us to change the counter, and then we're just gonna take counter plus 1. Okay. And let's see our app now. Okay, awesome. So this is what we wanted to see. And if I click, it automatically increments. So it shows me the value immediately because the state has changed. So this component updates. And if I refresh, it will go back to 0. Yeah, Alicia. I think you're muted. I can't hear
Oh,
you.
I'm sorry. Can you go back to your code?
Yeah.
So that counter,
Mhm.
what is that on line 6? What is that called? Is that a variable? Is that a,
This is, yeah, it's a variable. This is the state. So we instantiated a variable in our state that we're able to kind of keep track of this variable. So we wanted a place to hold our count, right? So we did use state to give us access to that. So we wanted to put a counter in the state, and this hook gives us this function that allows us to also alter the counter. So we have a variable and we have a function that will allow us to change that variable. So this is because if we just change the variable itself, so let's do that actually.
yeah, I think I'm getting confused on, I think, the layout of all the different parts here. Like, what is the state? What's the variable? What's the function? What's the...
Yeah, so this variable is part of the state. So just think of like the state of this component, like the general state of this component, what is happening in this component. So this component right now has this variable.
And you could have named that anything you wanted.
Exactly. I can name it, I
You
don't
can
know.
leave it at counter, just, it's fine.
I can name it cat and it would be fine, yeah. So, okay, so if we do this. Okay.
But set counter is included with React is what?
So set counter will be returned from use state. So use state is a special function that allows us to create a variable that it keeps, like React keeps track of in the background. And we use the set counter because it needs to, React needs to know when we are changing this variable. It's not going to always check like, oh, did it change now? Did it change now? You know, so I'm going to show you here, if we don't use set counter, how it's not going to show on our front end pretty much.
Okay, and it's, so you, and it's, I see you did +1, so it's different from like all of the other languages. It's not going to be plus equals.
I believe we can do plus equals here.
The reason, one of the main reasons I'm asking for what these things are called is like, as we start using ourselves, probably find ourselves in a place where we have to Google like, what are all the included, I guess, states in React or something, so that we know how we can edit variables, I guess.
Yeah, so with the state, you create it. You can create, you create the variables that you want to keep track of. If you're like, just based on what functionality you're trying to build out, you're like, okay, I need a variable that keeps track of the number of likes this thing got, or I need a variable that keeps track of the result of this function. I don't know what it is, but so you're going to be creating these based on what your application needs. And this just allows you to have a variable that will automatically update on the front end when you change it in the back end. Not back, I mean, it's not back end, but like back end of React. And it will change on, it will render on the page. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it will once we get more examples than just the counter, so.
Okay, yeah, Caleb.
Yeah, just so I know I got this down right. When you say use state and the 0 in parentheses, that 0 is setting the counter equal to 0.
Exactly.
To initialize. Okay, thank you.
Exactly, yeah. So if I do it 1, it will initialize to 1. So let's see what happens if we don't use set counter. So I'm going to open my console for this. Okay, so if I click, it should give me Assignment to constant variable. Oh, okay. So because it's a constant variable, it's not letting me change it anyways. So that's good behavior. I could say I think let would do, or var or something like that. Let me see this now. Yeah, so it's telling me that the counter is 1, but on here it's still 0. So if I keep clicking, it'll increment, but it's not actually updating on the front end. And the reason is I didn't use this specific function. So React doesn't know that the value has changed. Only we do, because we did the console log and we changed the counter, which is what we don't want to do. So if you ever want to change your state, you have to use the function that comes with it. Okay. Constant. And then, yeah, Jake.
2 quick questions.
Mhm.
On line 2, how do we know when to use curly brackets when we're importing something?
Curly brackets is usually when there's multiple things in that thing. So if there's multiple modules, so like use state, React has more than just use state inside of it. So you're gonna need curly braces, and you could probably do like, I know for sure use effect is another one. So you can import them this way. If it's the only one that's there, you typically don't need to. Like here when we did import app from /app, app is the only function. Sorry, I need to close this. App is the only function that is being exported. And you kind of know this from export default app. And
Okay, so it's just like a specific thing that we're trying to grab from React.
yeah.
Okay, and then another quick question is on line 14, I've just never seen class name equals app. I just like in regular HTML, I thought it was just class equals like app. Is that something that's specific to React?
I think so. I do believe so, yeah. Because the class name is used quite a lot in here, and it's usually used instead of class.
Okay, cool, thank you.
I just want to add on to that really quick. So it is a really good observation. For the most part here, our JSX is supposed to look exactly like HTML. But that's definitely like the first exception that you might notice, that we write class name instead of class. The reason why is because we're actually still inside of a JavaScript file here. And in JavaScript, class is a reserved keyword. So apparently like it would just conflict with like reserved keywords in JavaScript if we actually used class for HTML class. So we have to call it class name, just to use a different word that isn't reserved in JavaScript. I think it's kind of dumb, but that's what you gotta do.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Any other questions?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So for line 6, is that destructuring or deconstruction pattern?
I think so. I don't know. This is that.
Okay, so assuming it is,
yeah.
when you call use state, does that always return? Is that returning a? When you say use state 0, is that returning an array and then you're assigning it to those variables?
Yeah, it's returning 2 objects pretty much. And
okay.
The first one is going to be your counter variable, which has the value 0, and then the second one is the function.
Okay, so it always returns 2 objects then, right?
Exactly.
Okay,
yeah,
got it.
every single time.
Thank you.
Oops. Any other questions? Okay. How do you guys feel about like a quick 5-minute break? And then come back? Yeah. Okay. We'll come back at 55. Yeah. 55. All right, everyone. Are you ready to begin again? Or continue? No. All right. I think we're missing a few people, so I'm waiting. Awesome. Okay. Cool. So what we did before is just change a few things in our main app component. So we just added a button that was able to increment and then give us the value. So if you're developing an application of whatever size, you generally don't want everything in one file. And that's kind of the whole point of having components, is you're sectioning things off into different little pieces. So I'm going to create a folder inside my source folder called components. It's generally good practice to just put all of your components in there. And in that, I'm going to create a button counter component. So I'm going to call it button counter. Did I spell it correctly? .jsx. And there we go. So we have a button component. I'm going to copy this. Actually, I'll just create a new one, but I'll copy. Let me scaffold it out first. So I'm going to import use state, because I know I'm going to need to use that. So use state from React. I like the autocomplete because it knows these like basic ones. And I'm going to create a new component function, button counter. And then I'm going to add a return event. Okay. And in this return, I'll just put a div in there. Because if I know there's going to be more than just one element, I might as well just put it in there. Okay. So we'll take these out and put them into our button counter. Okay, so now we have our button, we have our display. And I'm also going to take these. I'm going to take the state that I created and our function. Because I don't really need them here anymore. Sorry, the indentations are missing me up now. Okay, there we go. And then export. Well, button counter. Okay. What am I missing? I think I have everything here. Okay, so now what we need to do is import it into our app so it actually displays. I don't need to do that anymore. Okay. So we just do import button counter from /components, because that's where our button counter is, /button counter. You don't actually have to do the .jsx, but you can. It just, the project knows where that is a JavaScript file. Okay, so we do that, and then we just have to instantiate it. So we just call it like a normal, like another component. So like an H2 or whatever block we want. And that is it. So when we call it now, it should still show up like we expect it to. So here, there we go. it's still there. If we look at our elements, so we have, here's our root. So remember in our HTML file, we have our body, which is the entire page. Our root is this div that's in the middle. And it's just there because that's all, we don't have anything else anywhere else. So it kind of just shrinks to fit it. So this is our class, our app. And you see here, it says class instead of class name, which is what is it called? Raphael was mentioning, like, because it's in HTML, it's class, but JavaScript, it's class name. And so we have our H2, and then we have another div, which is our button that we created, that new button counter component. And yeah, and it's encapsulated in this div, and that's the part that we see in blue here. Okay, yeah, Michael.
Yeah, can you go back to your code real quick?
Mhm.
So when you call button counter, you put a space before closing the tag. Is that like normal convention, or is that just like
No.
personal preference?
You don't have to. I just did it because, yeah, so it still works if you don't.
Okay, yeah, I was just curious because I saw that in it was like that in those PowerPoints too, so I wasn't sure if that was just how it was done.
No, I just think it's easier to read. And also if you want to enter any props in here, yeah, so like title equals something. And so just, it allows you to just click and start typing.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? So now what this allows us to do is, if we want multiple of these button counters, we're able to just add a bunch, add however many we want. Just gonna copy and paste. I feel like that's enough. And there we go. We just have a bunch of them. And so because the state was handled inside of each component, if I click this, it won't affect any of the other ones. So each state is being managed by its own component. So yeah, each one is separate, which is very, very helpful. Okay, that's the wrong way. Any questions? Okay.
I have a question.
Uh-huh.
So, okay, so for this, I get that this is like an example of how you were saying we're creating like reusable components. They're kind of each self-contained.
Yeah.
Say we wanted to have a different, like I don't know, a different sort of div or something. So will we need to have something like a different item under components for each function that we want?
Pretty much, yeah. So for each component, or like for each piece of your screen, you would want to have a different component that handles. Yeah, you wanna kind of abstract them as much as you can, and kind of have like little movable pieces that you can nest in each other.
So like, would we have one for like a nav bar, one for widgets, one for?
Exactly.
So that list probably gets pretty long sometimes.
Yeah, it could. Yeah, definitely.
Okay. And how does that, all right, never mind. I'll wait. You're probably going to cover it.
No, you can ask.
I was just curious what this looks like if we're doing additional pages.
Okay. It'll pretty much look the same. We'll see that later. So we'll probably have a like screen folder, or I'm not sure of the exact convention, but I would create like a screens folder and have like the screen template pretty much in each of those, and then components would belong to screens. So like a nav bar would probably be in the app one, because the nav bar is going to be seen on pages and so on. Yeah, Kaylee.
Can I see the button counter?
Did you have a specific question or just wanted to see it?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I just wanted to see it really quick.
Oh,
Sorry.
okay.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. All right. So one more thing I wanted to mention about state. So we saw that we need to use set counter. So let's see what happens if I do a console log right after it. Then counter. Yeah, Alicia.
You showed us that when you refresh the page, then it starts over. I guess most often, is that what you would want most often, or how would you prevent that from happening?
So that we'll cover later.
Okay.
So with that, you would have state managed kind of on a bigger scale of the application. So it will hold on to it throughout what it refreshes and stuff like that.
Okay.
But yeah, we'll talk about it at a later date. Yeah.
My other question was also going to be like, is there a easy way of like adding a button that resets the counter back to 0, or like would that use set counter equals 0 or something? Like would it be that easy? Or
yeah, we could definitely do let's say reset counter. And we would just say set counter 0. And that's, so if we had a button that would be for resetting, we can actually just add a button here. And then on click, we'll just put and then let's see what this does. The nice thing is I don't have to, I keep going to refresh the page, but so yeah, I do that and then reset, it goes back to 0.
Excellent, thanks.
Okay, so I did want to show something real quick. So when I click, it just shows I did a console log after the set counter. And if we see here, it's showing 0, even though the counter is 1. And then every time I click, it's lagging 1 behind. So this is because our set counter, it fires asynchronously. So because of like how fast instructions are, it gets to this one before counter is actually updated. So if you wanted to have a functionality where you're setting the counter multiple times, so if I wanted to like increment it a few times, it won't really work because your counter is always a little behind. So a way to get around that. So actually, let me show that this does what I want. So yeah, it's only doing one console log. Oh, anyways, it's still showing it's 1 behind, even though I did the set counter thing 3 times. So the way to get around that is you would say previous counter. So this is a built-in thing where previous is built into it pretty much. Actually, I don't know if we're just
You have to add it as a parameter.
It's a parameter. Wait, we have to add it as a parameter?
Or, yeah, so there's a different syntax for set counter. You can, instead of just passing in the value you want to set it to, you can pass in a callback function, and that function gets the previous value passed in.
So this is like that, pretty much.
Something like that.
Yeah, so this is the parameter that it's taking in, and this is just a name that we're giving it. And then this is the resulting function that we want to execute. So we want to take in whatever the value was, and then send in the value of this plus one. So if I do this, refresh, and if I click, so it clicked the button 3 times. This is still 0. Hold on. But yeah, so it was, yeah, it is incrementing. So before it wasn't actually incrementing by it. So here we can see, no, it shouldn't. Yeah, the counter should show. Oh, okay. So in the previous example, when I didn't have all of this, when I was doing just set counter, counter plus 1, no matter how many times I put this, it increments just once because the counter was always the first value. So in this case, at the beginning, it's a 0. So however many times I put set counter, it's going to be 0. And then so the value is going to be 1, and that's the only value that comes out. But because I'm using the previous counter, I don't actually need these. Because I'm using the actual counter, it increments however many times I want it to. So let me demonstrate this one more time so it's a little clearer. Okay. So if I just do counter plus 1, even though I did it 3 times, I'm only going to see 1 button click, 2, 3. But if I do this set, it should increment by 3. Reset, click. So button was clicked 3 times, 6 times, 9. Does that make sense?
So to clarify, it's still not going to fix the console log being behind, but it will increment times.
Yeah, exactly.
So when you're using the counter plus 1 method, you said if you put that in multiple times, it's always going to have the same result. Like set counter plus 1 is basically set counter 0 plus 1, and you're just saying
Every
that
time.
5 times. It's always 1, right?
Yeah.
So if you're saying set counter plus 1 and it's saying counter is 0 plus 1, isn't the function of set counter supposed to modify counter? And why wouldn't the next one be 1 plus 1 and then 2 plus 1? When is set counter actually updating itself? When it leaves the entire function?
I think I actually don't know. I think counter is updated like the last thing, but it somehow has access to the previous counter before counter itself is updated. It's something within the internal workings of the state. Yeah, but for some reason this works and this doesn't. Yeah, does that kind of, I know it's not a good answer, but
It's just weird because when you do set previous counter plus 1, you're not talking about counter, you're talking about previous counter, yet counter changes.
so counter will change because we're using set counter.
Okay,
So
yeah, fair
previous,
enough. I
so
just-
this
okay.
name is just an arbitrary name for whatever
see.
the variable is that it has access to.
Sure, it could have been value plus one. I get
Exactly.
it.
So if I
Okay,
said val and then val plus one,
okay,
it will be the same. Yeah.
okay. That's interesting. That's a weird kind of behavior.
Yeah, I agree. But yeah, that's.
I have a question.
Uh-huh.
So when you're calling set counter in lines, well,
Oh.
line 10,
Okay.
is there like is there a state property on the component that sets? Is it saying like component dot state equals prev counter, and then it's that function? Well, I guess my to boil the question down, does the component have a state property?
Yes. And this is our state here that we created. So our state property is counter because we created it through use state. And set counter, when we send in something, it will alter counter here.
Okay.
Yeah,
Thanks.
so on the inside, it will alter it here. It takes in, so if it's in this syntax where it's like a function, this is the variable that set counter has access to. So it's not the variable that we have access to because that wasn't updated yet. It's on the inside. This is what it has access to, but it's pretty much the same thing. It's just the order of things that happen, like the sequence of things that are happening is a little different. So if we use this variable, it will reflect before counter, and that way we can actually add it in sequence, like one right after the other.
Is it similar to like a destructive versus a non-destructive method? Like it seems like counter plus one is essentially non-destructive because it just returns a value. But previous counter plus one is destructive because it actually changes the value that you're affecting, not necessarily just returning. It kind of feels like that in a way.
I'm actually not sure.
Fair enough. That was just an interpretation, probably. But
yeah.
I'd say they're both destructive. They both change the value of counter. The thing is that like the variable counter on line 5 doesn't get updated in the middle of increment counter running. So like if you just set counter plus one over and over, counter has the same value every time that runs. So you're just resetting it to the same value like 3 times in a row. Whereas if you use the other syntax for set counter where you pass in a callback function, every time your callback function is called, it gets the latest updated value of previous counter passed in. So we can do that 3 times in a row, and it's going to get the latest previous counter every time it runs.
Oh, that makes sense. Okay, thanks. Yeah.
Awesome. Skylar, I saw your hand up before. Yes, no. Am I muted? No. Okay. If you have a question again, please, please ask. All right. So any last questions about this? Yeah, Skylar. Yeah, you.
Got that double mute going on, Skylar. We'll get it worked out.
Okay, yeah, so before Raphael explained it, the way I was thinking of it was like when the function is called increment counter, counter is grep, the variable counter, but like Raphael said, it's not being updated. So it's not actually being added to. And only in the, we would call that just an inline function, right? Like 10. You could call that like an inline.
Yeah, yeah.
Cool.
Awesome. Okay, so now that we've kind of exhausted states, let's work with props. What I want to do is I'm going to split this function or split this component into two separate components. Our button component, I'm going to actually remove this one right now because I'm not sure where it's going to. Actually, no, I can have that in there. So I'll split it into a button and then an output. What's called an output label function. So, or component, I'm sorry. Okay. Let's say the first one is, let's call it increment button. And then our second will be reset button. And none of these are created yet, so we will be creating them in a sec. And then for our last one, we'll have an output label. All right. So our increment button, our button counter has use of the state. And we want the state to be, we want the state to stay in the button counter because we want all of the components to be in sync. So what we can do, since we have the counter piece, which our output is going to use, and then we have our methods, which our buttons are going to use in this component, we can actually send those in to their respective components. And that way, each of those could use them without having to have like this stuff in here. So let's create this one. So increment button .jsx. And I'll do the reset button and the output. Before I finish from here, I just want to import these real quick. Implement.
So while you're typing that, you made a separate file just for the output label, which literally just says, you know, you've clicked it X amount of times. We're really going to be creating a file for like every single tiny line of text.
No, you don't really have to. We just want to demonstrate the props and sending in information to other things. Sometimes it is just a button that's in your component, but it has extra functionality that you want to keep specific to that component. So it makes each component lighter. So even our like top level component, which is this, it would be a little easier to read than. So if you're looking at this, you kind of have to decipher what all of this is doing. But if you see just these three, you're like, okay, there's an increment button, a reset button, and an output label inside of this thing. And each of those have their own functions. So it is kind of like when you're building like a Python application and you want to keep your methods like small and single function, that's kind of how your components are supposed to be. But yeah, if there's only like one line, you don't really need to. It depends on what you're doing with your components. So yeah, you usually have like the liberty of playing around with that and stuff like that. Okay, I'll import these after, so they'll be what's it called? I'll get the autocomplete.
Can you put that same function in the output label, the const counter thing?
Which one?
In the output label, you put that const counter, all of that, or no?
No. So I'll show you how we can have access to that. Because if I do that, it's gonna create a separate state inside that output.
Okay, so you're about to tie them all to the same.
Yeah,
Okay.
exactly. So yeah, I'll just scaffold this out real quick. The increment button. And then I think I did this. And then in here, it's going to take in props. That's we define it there. And then I'm going to do this for reset. And same for output. All right. So in this button, our increment button is gonna hold that. So we give it a return. And in this return, I'll just do a div in case I want to add anything later. And then I have my button. So we haven't sent in our increment counter. So how do we do this? Actually, I'll just finish up this first. Release the button. Forgot my tip, but it's fine. It won't give me an error right now. Okay. So none of these buttons have access to the functions. So the way that we do this is let's call it handle click. So for this button method, and we literally just send in the increment counter function. And that's it. Same for this. Handle click equals reset counter. And then for this one, we want to send in the counters. So value equals counter, or we can call it counter. We can call it anything, honestly. So as long as this name matches whatever you put inside here, or however you access it, then you're fine. So in a way, the name that you name it out here is what determines how you access it inside the component itself. So let's start with the increment button. So the name of it is going to be handle click. So if we go in here, instead of just increment counter, because that we don't know what that name is anymore, we have access to our properties. So we do props dot handle click. How did I? Yeah. And that should be it. So if we go, okay, let me fix my imports real quick so we can test these out. Components. That's /, increment button, and then oh, that's why. Okay, it's just /. I forgot we're inside the same folder, so we don't need to actually have that. And then our output label. Okay, so now if we go there, code. Reset counter is not defined. Okay, so there's still issues because I have stuff that it doesn't know what it is. So let's fix that real quick. Okay, so we have another handle click, and then we have value for our output label. So in here, it's going to be props dot handle click. And then for this one, it's going to be props dot value. Okay, theory, this should work. And here you can actually keep track of the errors. So before I had an error, but I didn't scroll down. Oops. Okay, so our click works, our reset works, and yeah, everything looks good. This is just the old stuff that was there. Yeah, let me go back. What was it? 57? No. 5173. Okay. So yeah, it all works together. So I'm going to go back to the code and kind of do one more rundown of it. So right now what's displaying on in our app is, this is our main app div. We have our header and we have 2 button counters. So the button counters are these components. So each button counter is comprised of 3 inner components that we created. We have an increment button, a reset button, and an output label, which we see here. So this, and that. And so per each button counter, we have a counter state. So we're keeping track of how many counts across this entire component. And the way we're doing that, even though we have separate components for the buttons and the labels, we are sending in whatever those components need. So the buttons need functions to click on, or like on-click functions, and our label needs something to display. So it needs the value of whatever it needs to display. And yeah, so within each of these methods, within each of these components, we have whatever we need to display. So button has a button, and we're able to access the function through props dot whatever we sent in, the name of whatever we sent in here. Any questions? Any confusion? Is the flow kind of making sense? How things are structured, things are being called. Yeah. Again, we have our app. We have our 2 button counters, and then we have our different pieces here.
Did you point out, I noticed you used handle click rather than on click. Did you say something about that?
So handle click is whatever name you give it. So this is the name of the property that you're sending in to that
Right.
component. And that is how it's going to access it. So I can call it
Is there a
onClick.
difference between using that or onClick? Is there a part?
So onClick is the part where
Oh, I see.
is the part that the button knows. So button needs an onClick function. So handle click is just the name that we gave it. So if I name
Oh, okay.
this, yeah,
I see
so if
what
I
you
name
did.
this click function, all I would have to change is the way that I'm accessing it here. So this would be click function.
I understand. Okay.
Any other questions?
You're importing button counter in each of these, right?
No. So
On
button
increment
counter is the parent, and it includes these three components. So I'm importing these three components into button counter because it will display these three components in here. Button counter is being displayed on the app component. So this is where we import it.
Okay, so the class tried to help me out, but I'm gonna ask it anyways.
Yeah,
So
please.
if you go to button counter,
Uh-huh.
you could click
Oh,
on that.
go to, but yeah.
So anything before the return is considered a prop.
No, so the props are things that are sent in from the parent function. And so button counter doesn't have props that we sent in at the moment. So if I did, I would access them through putting in the in these parentheses, I would just say props, and I would have access to the props. And the props would have to be sent in from here. So let's say I have a prop called name, and that name is going to be button counter 1. Okay. So here, if I want, I could say, I could just display that. I would access it by calling props, which is here, dot name, which is what I gave it over here, right, in the app. So I should be able to see button counter 1 for this one. Yeah, there we go.
So it sounds like props is going to be what handles our Django data from the back end and holds onto it so that we can use it, kind of like we do in the templating data.
Yeah, most likely. Yeah. Yeah, John.
So can you go back to the button counter? So it looks like, okay, so anything with the JSX name
Mhm.
is a component, and then we import each component we want to use in this component, and then whenever we use a tag with that component's name, if we basically, so like on line 21, increment button is a component that we imported,
Mhm.
and then we give it the property, I guess,
Yeah.
click function,
Uh-huh.
right?
It actually says here, yeah, it's
Okay.
a property. Yeah.
And, and so all those increment 21, 22, 23, all those components are children of this component,
Exactly.
and all the children will have access to all the properties. Is that correct?
So the children will have access to the properties that are sent in to that child
Oh, through that. Okay.
through here. Yeah. So increment button doesn't know anything about handle, click, or value.
Okay. But if we wanted to include value in increment button, we just would have to add value on that on line
Exactly.
21.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
And the way to do that is just you just do it with space. You don't need like commas or anything. So
Okay.
I could say value equals something. Yeah.
Can you show me the increment button again?
Yeah.
Props dot click function. So in theory, could you, instead of doing props dot click function, could you just pass in increment counter and just do props dot increment counter?
Yeah, yeah. Let's do that. We would have to give it a name, so
Oh, it does need a name.
yeah. I believe, I don't know if it works in, let's see. I used to be able to do, I think maybe in class components, I don't know. I used to be able to do this where I can send in like, I would just send it in like this, but I think you have to specify the function. No. Okay, let's see if it works. I don't think it will, but
Looks like it's not the right color.
yeah, exactly. We called it increment. I think it might have been with class components that I was able to do that. Yeah, because it's not seeing it as a function.
Okay, and is your bottom button working now
The bottom one?
on the website?
Which one?
That one, because you said that's the old stuff, but I don't understand why it's not working, because you just have in your app thing, you just say 2 button counters. So why isn't that one working?
So it's not working at the moment because I changed this and I broke it. I broke the on click.
Oh, okay, so both of them were working before?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
So let me just go back on here real quick. Okay. Click function, cool. Yeah, because both of them are the same exact component, just multiplied. So this works, and then I can reset. So here, if we went back to the app, we see that there's just 2 of them. See, I gave a name to one of them, but we don't, it doesn't really care because we don't.
Okay.
Yeah.
So is that how we would customize it if we wanted to use the same piece, but we wanted to have like different information for each one? Is that how we?
Exactly. So if we had like an array of titles and we wanted like a separate component for each of those titles and there's information, we would loop through those titles here and then we would create a component for each loop. And we would send in whatever the title or whatever information we had as props.
And can we pass in as many parameters as we want? Like, let's say we wanted to set up something with like a different title, a different image. So like putting like the SRC there and stuff like that. We can pass in as many as we want.
Yeah, yeah. You can also pass in objects, which is nice. So you can, yeah. So an actual, like an entire object could be here. And then on the other side, you would do props dot whatever the object name is dot whatever the attribute name is. Any other questions? Okay. What time is it? Okay, let's see if we can get through. There's not much left. There's only a little bit. So try to get through this before 11.
It would be nice also to maybe take a brief break before our speaker shows up.
Yeah, okay. I'll try to take only like 10 minutes. Let's see. Okay, what if we wanted to do some more, a little bit more complex output? So if we wanted to do like max count or something like that, I don't know, we wanted to display something different based on what our value is. So there's a way to do like weird if statements in here, but the better way to do that is have a function to render your output. So let's call this render output. Okay. So we can say if our counter, which we don't have access to that, if our props dot value, actually I can just say here, So I can give it an alias, so I can say counter equals props dot value. So that way I can just call it counter within my component and not have to deal with doing props dot every single time. So
Counter.
Sorry.
You left the T out of counter up above line 2.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. Okay. Counter was 0. I forgot you need parentheses in here. Okay. So if counter equals 0, let's return you haven't clicked the button yet. And like, let's say we want a max count. So we can make a variable that holds the max count. Max count equals, let's say 5. And then if our counter is greater than max count, then we can say so if you want to add a variable in a string, you do the the special string things. It's in the corner under the escape button. I don't know what they're called. Carrots? No, that's not. That's the upward.
Those are backticks.
Backticks, thank you. Let's say we've clicked the counter more than, there's going to be spelling errors, that's okay. And then to put the variable in, you do $sign and parentheses or curly braces and max count times and then else we'll just return click the button. Count times. Or is it counter? It's counter. Okay, so in this case, instead of having this, we can just put the function in there and it will automatically insert the string that we want. So we can render our output. Actually, we have to put it in curly braces because here it's just going to think that it's just a name of something or like a string, sorry. So yeah, so here we call the function and let's look at it here. So here it shows you haven't clicked the button yet. And I keep clicking and now it's more than 5. It's not, that's the only message it's going to display based on the any questions? No? Okay, this is the last.
That's the language too.
Sorry?
If you reset it, will it reset the language too?
The reset? What do you mean?
Where? Like on the actual screen, if you were to click the reset button, does it know?
Yeah. Yeah, because it's all connected, so the counter will be 0. Awesome. Okay, so the last part is what if our data was not just a singular number? What if it was an array of something? So I'm gonna make another component I'm just gonna call it my component because for speed. JSX. And I'm going to use state. So let's call it component. And I'm going to define our state data. So I'll call the first variable my data, which is the actual state, and then set my data equals use state. And instead of just one number, I'm actually going to send in an array. I want this to be an array of random numbers. I don't know. Okay. So if we're gonna do, let's do our return. And this is going to return a list of our data. And since I don't know how many items are going to be inside of my state, I'm just going to have a function that can render my data for me. So I'm going to call render data, and then I'm going to create it real quick. So constant render data equals, the syntax is always a little tricky. So in here, I want to get my elements. So actually, I am going to copy this from here real quick. Copy. And I'll explain it. Okay. So what this is doing is it's creating an empty list for our elements that we're going to create. And then it's looping through the data. So my data.length is the max. So it's looping through those, and it's creating a list element for each of them. So this I'm actually going to put inside curly braces, because if I just left it like that, each list item will only have like the string my data at I, but this will actually allow it to be usable as a variable. And then we return the elements, and the elements are going to be list items in here. So what if I wanted to, what is it called? Append more data. So let's call it, how are we doing on time? Okay. Do we want to finish this after? That's kind of quick, but
We might have to come back to this.
yeah, let's do that so you guys can get a little break. Yeah, come back at 11 and we'll have our guest speaker, and then we'll continue this later on. All right, so before our break, bless you. Bless you. So before our break, we wanted to see an example of our data being in an array. So if we had a few elements in our state data. So I wrote a small component that renders a list, and in that list is just the data that is in the array. So if I display this, just gonna close all of this extra stuff. So I'm gonna import it into my main app. And it was called my component. Yeah, it's in here. Slash components slash my component. And then I'm just gonna remove this stuff. Just put my component. So all this is gonna show me, oops. What was 17? No, 71.
5173.
Thank you. 5173. Oh, I did not export it properly. But okay, I didn't export it at all. So it didn't know what my component was. So export it default. My component. All right, so now we should be able to see, yeah, exactly. So it's just the list of the items in my data here. Okay. So let's say I want to add an element to this. So it's going to create a div around this, and then I'm going to add a button that will allow me to call a function that appends more data. Button. I don't we really need the ID, so I'm just gonna say with me, and on click, I'm gonna create a function called append data. So this append data, what are we going to do? Oops. Okay. So I want this append data to give me a new number. So new number equals, I'm just going to give it a random number. So this is the way to do a random number here. So math.floor. Math.random times 20. So this gives a number, a random number up to 20. So between 0 and 20. And let's say we do this. No, new data equals our elements, our existing elements. So my data. And then we can append one. Right. Okay. New data dot append. So this is just a list. Oh, actually, sorry, it's not append, that's Python, it's push. So when you're adding to a list, it's going to be push here. And we can put the new number. And then set, what's it called? Set my data, new data. Okay, so let's see what happens here. So here, if we click, we get an error.
I think you need to do math that's capitalized.
I think I
Line
have
eight.
to, yeah. Thank you. Let's do this. Okay, so nothing is happening. So that means something is wrong. Can someone tell me what is happening here that might be the issue?
Do you need to import random?
No, so random is actually giving us a new number. So if I did,
Oh,
yeah. Log. So it's something with our setting the data. So yeah, if I, oh, now because we updated it, it has all of these. But yeah, so it's giving me new ones, but it's not updating, it's not rendering here. So that means it's not capturing the new information. So pretty much we're modifying our state data. So here we set this new list equal to our old list, and this is not instantiating a new list at all. It's just pushing new data to our old list pretty much, which is what happened in our counter earlier when we were trying to just do counter equals counter plus 1. So this is not going to actually do anything. So the new way to do this is there's this cool operator. It's called the spread operator, which allows you to, you don't have to do an append. You're not creating anything, like you're not adding to the list exactly. You are using this to grab the stuff that you had in my data. So this is ... my data. And then comma, you put your new number. And this will create a list with this new number appended, which is pretty cool. So what this does is it takes all the elements from my data, and then this is going to be this entire part. So this is going to look like 5, 4, 2, and then you're adding a new number to it. So this is our new list, pretty much. It's just easier than creating a new list and then copying everything over from my data and then adding a new one and then setting it equal to this. So now this should work because we're creating a new list and then we're setting data, the data in the state equal to this new list. So let's see if this works. I keep doing this, huh? Okay, so this is our initial list. If I click it, it should automatically add, which it does. And it's pretty much just updating it with the new list every single time. And that's it. That's all I have for you guys. Any questions? Yeah, Michael.
I just had a question about the spread operator. Is that like a JSX specific thing, or is that in JavaScript? Like,
I think
overall?
it's JavaScript. I believe it's JavaScript. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Alicia. Yeah.
So I got a little bit confused by the key down there on line 17. It looks like that would just be like 0, 1, 2, 3. What is that for?
This is just to have the list item have a key. So it's kind of like an ID pretty much.
So kind of like an ID, or like...
No, it is like an ID. So usually when you create list items, you want to have a key in there to identify each one of them. So it's like an ID.
Could you still target that with CSS just like you do IDs, or no?
I believe so. This one, yeah, so this one helps you to access that element if you need to. I'm not sure if it's with CSS, but I know like if you need to use it in another component or something like that, you need access to this list element, you can do it by the key. Raphael, do you have any note?
Yeah, I've got a few things to add. So why don't we actually take a look at this a little deeper? Can you, in addition to the key on the list item, can you add an ID that's going to be exactly the same, just a number or whatever? Cool. So can we render that and see it in the browser?
Yep.
And then let's inspect it. All right, so if we look at our list items here, we can see that they have the IDs that we gave them, 0, 1, 2, or whatever. But the key property doesn't actually show up in the DOM, doesn't actually make it all the way to the browser. So a lot of these properties that we set in React, they're just regular HTML properties. But key is actually kind of special. It's like a fake HTML property. It's really just something that React uses internally to keep track of things, but doesn't actually end up in the HTML that's on the page. The thing is that when React, or really like any modern front-end framework, is trying to render a list of items, sometimes it gets confused about like what order things are in or what is actually a different item. Like imagine if you're trying to sort a list of objects and you have two objects that are just the key name with the value Alice. Like those are different objects in memory, but like they have the same properties on them. So I guess like React gets confused sometimes when it's like re-rendering your list. Like, is this actually the same element, or did I like put the other one in its place when they were supposed to be somewhere else? I don't know. I don't like totally understand all the logic at a fine level, but somehow that key property helps React like avoid getting confused when it's rendering a bunch of objects in a list that could potentially have the same properties on them. I know I've used a bunch of other front-end frameworks in the past, and they've all had the same issue where when you render a list of data, you have to provide a key property so the framework knows which one's which. It's just some unique identifier. So usually like a for loop index or a database ID is generally what I use for the key. It's never something that I've thought too hard about. And I honestly don't know why the framework can't figure this out for me, but this is something that we have to do.
Gotcha, thanks. And then I also couldn't help but notice that you had on there like render elements, which is technically an array of LIs, but it doesn't render as an array of LIs. It's just a regular list of LIs. So is that always going to be the case, is that it's just going to render the contents inside of the array and not attempt to display the actual like brackets or anything?
Yeah, it won't display brackets. It is technically an array of these LIs. That's just how, yeah, it doesn't display brackets. It just knows to show all the items one after the other. Maya, yeah. You're muted.
Sorry, the 3 dots, the ellipses that you used on line 10, it seems like that's essentially doing the same thing as like a slice. So does that work on its own, or does it only work when you add in that second parameter?
No, it works on its own too. So if I didn't add this, it would just create this with the data inside my data.
So it's just
create
like
a new list.
shorthand slice.
Yeah.
Okay.
So if I did this, see, it's just creating the same data over and over because I didn't add anything in there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Any other questions? No. Okay. Well, if no one has anything else to ask or add, this will be it for our lecture today. Any questions about React in general or anything else?
I have a React question, Zainab. I get that the components are just kind of like building blocks for what we want on our site.
Mhm.
What was the main JSX versus the I think it was
Here.
main,
Main
yeah, and then
app.
app JSX.
Yeah. So main is going to hold our React DOM render. So this function calls or accesses the document, so the HTML document, and it finds the root element, which is here. It's just a div.
Okay.
And oops, it pretty much just injects whatever we send in. So here, it's generally good practice to, or best practice to encapsulate everything in one app component. So this is all this is doing. It's rendering our app within like React on our root element on the HTML page. And this is all it's going to be doing. And here you can also add like app specific stylings. Like I said, just like general, what is it called? Like font families and colors and stuff like that. Maybe you want every single button in your app to have like a certain rounded edge. You can just do it in the top one or something like that. But yeah, so this is just rendering this here. So we want to keep this minimal. And then all of our actual app components will end up going in the app or in nested components, wherever, yeah, whatever we have.
Okay. And one other question I had is with the components, we'll need to export and also import like each one of them. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions? Okay.